My family cut me out of the will because I was too independent, so I bought the inheritance and donated it to charity. There was no storm the day they cut me out of the will, no screaming, no long-winded confrontations, just the rustle of paper, the faint scratch of a pen across parchment, and my name, absent. They dressed it in delicately chosen words, of course. Too independent, they said. A phrase that hung in the air like perfumed poison, meant to sound flattering but laced with condescension. A backhanded compliment wrapped in the velvet glove of family politics. They said I'd be fine on my own, that others needed it more. They paraded that rationale like it was noble, generous, even merciful, as if it were some great favor to liberate me from the burden of wealth I hadn't asked for but, by every logical measure, was due. There was a moment, just one, when I considered speaking up. A flicker of heat beneath my ribs, the instinct to protest, to drag their hypocrisy out into the light and let it rot beneath the weight of their lies. But I didn't. I let the silence settle like dust on an untouched shelf. My eyes passed over each of them, taking in the self-satisfied smirks, the practiced pity, the subtle narrowing of eyes that sought to convey regret, but failed to hide their quiet triumph. I nodded once, slowly, and left the room with the same calm resolve I had honed over the years they'd spent underestimating me. They didn't understand that the very independence they weaponized against me was the furnace in which I had forged my strength. I had never needed handouts, never begged for approval, never waited for anyone to anoint me worthy. While they wallowed in cyclical failure, drowning in debts born of excess and excuses, I was building, not loudly, not with dramatic flair, but piece by piece, contracts, clients, capital, an empire rising in silence. My name, the one they erased from the will with such flippant assurance, had grown louder in boardrooms than it ever had at family dinners. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving, under the radar, away from their petty gossip and corrosive entitlement. They believed I lived in solitude. They had no idea I was surrounded by networks, alliances, and respect that came not from bloodlines, but from worth. So when the estate, the land they clung to as a symbol of generational pride, the house that creaked with ancient secrets, the paintings they dusted with reverence only on holidays, went up for sale, I didn't hesitate. I had no need to negotiate. I made the offer in full, transferred the funds in less than a day. The broker didn't blink. Legally sound, official, inarguable. The signatures came easy. The ink dried fast. The name on the deed now bore the moniker they'd once deemed too independent. The press conference wasn't for spectacle. It was strategy. There, beneath the cool sheen of spotlights and the drone of cameras, I unwrapped their legacy and handed it to strangers. Each acre of land, donated to environmental restoration programs they'd called hippie nonsense. Every antique, every heirloom once displayed as a reminder of our refined lineage, now auctioned for refugee relief and healthcare clinics they'd mocked. Historical pieces, they claimed, preserved the dignity of our heritage, now rehomed in museums curated by the very communities they'd scorned. I didn't just donate the assets. I rewrote the story. I could see it in the eyes of the reporters. Confusion first, then curiosity, then admiration. But that didn't matter. I wasn't doing it for applause. I was doing it for the silence, for that sacred stillness that comes after a blow so quiet and so irreversible that it doesn't make noise. It just echoes. When the news reached them, they didn't call. Not immediately. I imagine they fumed in their kitchens, clutched their mocktail glasses tighter, spat indignation into the void of their private groups. But eventually, one by one, they reached out. Some disguised their desperation in politeness. Others draped themselves in nostalgia, suddenly remembering childhood memories I didn't recall being so fondly shared. One cousin called and simply asked, "Why?" No anger, no theatrics. Just the one-word question that slithered through the phone like a ghost of conscience. I answered her the same way I answered the press. "Because I never needed the inheritance," I said, my voice as clear as the sky they always looked down on me beneath. "I just needed to prove I was always more than you gave me credit for." The silence that followed was beautiful. Now their once prized estate stands transformed. The house has been repurposed into a transitional shelter for displaced youth, its chandeliers casting light not on crystal and silver, but on warm meals and second chances. The vineyard they held as a symbol of class now serves as a permaculture learning center for immigrant families. Even the family crest, etched in wrought iron above the estate gates, remains, but it bears a new inscription beneath it, carved with cold precision. Fortune favors not the born, but the built. I visit sometimes, not to gloat, not to reminisce, just to walk the halls as they fill with laughter foreign to our old gatherings. There's a freedom in that space now, a soul born of compassion rather than obligation. And when I pass the portraits they left behind, faces frozen in time, eyes full of long dead pride, I don't feel rage. I feel distance, a chasm they created with their arrogance, and I crossed with quiet fire. Their legacy is mine now, not because I stole it, but because they gave it up the moment they deemed me unworthy, and I returned it to the world in better shape than they ever left it. The sound of my footsteps against the marble floors echoed louder than it should have. The grand hall, once cloaked in hushed reverence and guarded by tradition, now welcomed the footfalls of children with untamed laughter and young voices unafraid to question. I walked slowly through the corridor that had once been the setting for countless family photographs, stiffly posed and curated for holiday cards and shallow pride. Now, the faded portraits glared down, not on kin, but on strangers they never would have let through the front gate without a sideways glance. Refugees, single mothers, runaway teens, the sort of people they deemed beneath us, their mere presence now a living defiance of every bitter legacy this house once held sacred. The walls hadn't changed, not physically at least. The same wood paneling, the same oil paintings with overwrought brushwork and expressions painted to project dignity, not humanity. But everything else had transformed. The air, once thick with the perfumed rot of tradition and exclusion, now carried the scent of meals cooked in joy, not formality. There were no formal dinners now, just shared tables, no proper rooms off limits to outsiders, just open doors, open arms, open lives. I didn't announce my visits, I never did. The administrators knew who I was, of course. My name was on every document, the signature that made their mission possible. But I didn't crave recognition. I wasn't interested in being treated like a patron saint or some billionaire savior. That would have made me just like them, wouldn't it? Clutching at legacy with greedy hands, trying to write my name into history with gold leaf and false modesty. No, I preferred to walk the halls like a ghost, present, unseen, content to observe the life that had replaced the rot. But sometimes, memory lingered where I least expected it. In the small study off the eastern wing, where my uncle once held court like a drunk philosopher, droning on about lineage and duty to a family name bloated by its own myth, the books remained, leather-bound, brittle, titles worn but legible. I ran a hand along their spines, remembering how forbidden they once were, how knowledge was doled out like a favor, not a right. Now, this room served as a quiet sanctuary for study groups and after-school tutoring. The chairs were mismatched. The scent of ink and old leather had been joined by cheap coffee and crumpled worksheets. It was beautiful. And yet, in that quiet, with sunlight slanting through stained glass windows depicting long-dead ancestors with expressions like solemn warnings, I could still feel the cold hands of the past clawing at the edges of the present. They had started showing up again, not to reclaim. They wouldn't dare, not legally. Every document was bulletproof, every transfer airtight, but they showed up like moths to the ruin of a flame they thought they controlled. A cousin loitering at the edge of a fundraiser, smiling with that same practiced sadness she used when she told me I was too self-sufficient to need help. An aunt who once laughed behind closed doors about those people, now volunteering at the front desk, insisting she believed in the mission all along. I watched them carefully, not with malice, but with the same caution one uses when approaching a dog that's bitten before. They weren't here for redemption. Not really. They were here to make sense of their own irrelevance, to carve themselves into the new narrative by proximity. But this house no longer echoed their name. Still, I allowed them in. There was a certain satisfaction in watching them walk the halls they once revered, now repurposed, reclaimed. The expression on my father's face the first time he saw the ballroom used as a clothing distribution center would remain one of the most exquisite moments of my life. Rows of racks holding donated coats and shoes, where once there had been crystal chandeliers and string quartets. He didn't say a word, but his silence thundered. His eyes roved the space, wide and hollow, trying to reconcile the death of his idea of heritage with the living pulse of compassion that now filled it. And still, he said nothing to me. They all knew who had done it. They all knew whose money had signed the checks, whose name had underwritten the transformation. And yet not one of them could bring themselves to acknowledge it. Not with honesty. To do so would mean facing the truth, that I had built something better than they ever could, using the very tools they dismissed me for having. I watched them from the second-floor balcony, a vantage point I had once stood at during dull family galas, pretending to care about dances and toasts. Now I watched children race below, volunteers gather, caretakers smile as they guided the old and young through a place once reserved for the elite. My family scattered through the crowd like ghosts dressed in borrowed kindness. There were moments, brief, sharp, where the old wound pulsed again, when I'd catch one of them looking too long at a sculpture that used to be grandmother's, when they walked past the family tree, now relegated to a side wall beside an interactive donor screen, and I could see the dissonance in their eyes. I knew what they were thinking, that it should have been preserved, that it meant something, that this place full of life and purpose and messy, beautiful progress was less dignified than the silent, curated museum they would have built in its place. But I had no interest in dignity without depth. The estate had once been a vault filled with treasures and names and a kind of pride that calcified over generations. I had turned it into a forge, where broken things were melted, reshaped, repurposed into something that could actually matter. They still didn't understand. They never would. Their anger had cooled into confusion. Their pride had decayed into impotence. And their attempts at rewriting the past came too late, because the future had already been claimed. I didn't need revenge. I had something better. I had permanence, not in memory, but in action, not in statues, but in lives changed. And every time they walked these halls, they were forced to see it, to feel it, to breathe in a legacy that no longer bore their fingerprints, but was now stained indelibly with mine. I returned for the final time on a morning thick with the hush of impending rain. The sky hung low as if mourning something unspoken. The estate, no longer mine, yet forever changed by my hands, stood quiet as I approached. Not abandoned, but full in the way old things get when they've found peace. The ivy had begun to crawl again, not in the manicured ornamental way it once had, but wild and reaching, curling over the stone like nature reclaiming its place. I liked that. It felt honest. The air smelled of soil and iron, not the scent of wealth or polish, but of permanence, of roots gripping deep beneath the surface. A small crowd had already gathered near the new entrance, a modest archway where the wrought iron gates once stood stiff with pride. Volunteers set up folding chairs and hung banners in soft colors bearing the foundation's new name, a name that bore no trace of my family's crest or lineage. Just a simple phrase, carved into the wood above the entrance. Shelter is a right, not a reward. I watched them work for a while, unnoticed, hands in the pockets of my coat, the weight of the past resting gently on my shoulders like a shawl finally worn thin. They didn't know I'd come. I hadn't told anyone. Not the board, not the press, not even the quiet administrator who still sent me quarterly updates and photos of the grounds. Today wasn't about them or me. It was about closing the circle. Inside, the halls were warm, not from heat but from movement, the kind of lived-in warmth that comes from breath and stories and shared burdens. The grand dining room, where once crystal stemware had clicked in hollow toasts, now served as a cafeteria. The walls bore murals, painted by residents, volunteers, children, scenes of homes and trees and hands held in 100 different shapes and shades. The past hadn't been erased. It had been painted over, absorbed, softened by something greater than memory. Purpose. As I walked, no one stopped me. A few offered polite nods the way one might greet a distant visitor or someone who looked vaguely familiar. That suited me. I didn't need recognition. The estate had never been a monument to my ego. It had been a battlefield, a crucible. And now it was simply a place where people came to start again. I made my way to the East Garden, the one they used to keep locked. It had once been a showpiece, a place to parade visiting guests with trimmed hedges and imported marble statues no one could name. I remembered being a child, pressing my face against the iron bars and wondering why a garden meant for beauty was kept hidden. Now, the hedges were gone. The statues had been sold. In their place, rows of vegetables stretched under trellises, wildflowers bloomed freely, and a few chickens pecked lazily near a compost bin. A small group of children were learning how to plant potatoes, their laughter punctuated by squeals and muddy hands. A woman, probably a volunteer, looked up and gave me a curious glance, then a smile. I nodded and turned away, the weight of everything finally beginning to settle in my bones. It had worked. Every decision, every signature, every unspoken defiance. The inheritance they had denied me had never been about money. It had been about power, about recognition, about the right to carry on a legacy that had, for so long, been used to exclude. But I had changed that legacy. I had broken it open, filled its hollow spaces with new voices, new stories. It no longer belonged to the bloodline that had tried to hoard it like a secret. It belonged to everyone now. I stood by the reflecting pool, once a centerpiece for their garden parties, now repurposed as a quiet meditation spot, and stared into the still water. My face, older, calmer, stared back, not triumphant, not bitter, just finished. That was when I heard her. "You really did it." I didn't turn immediately. I didn't need to. The voice, lined with age and regret, belonged to my mother. She stepped beside me, dressed in tailored gray, her hair pulled back in the same tight knot she wore to weddings, funerals, and public shame. Her hands were clasped, white-knuckled. She looked at the pool, not me. "We thought you'd burn it all down," she said after a moment. "Instead, you built something." I waited. Let the silence speak its truth. She had always struggled with apologies, not because she lacked the words, but because she never believed she owed anyone one. But now, at the edge of the last chapter, something in her had shifted. "I came to see it," she said, "not to take it back. I know that's impossible. I just wanted to understand." I gave her that. One final gift. I said nothing, just stood with her as the rain began to fall, soft, like a benediction. "I was wrong," she whispered, eyes still fixed on the rippling water. "We all were. We thought independence meant you didn't need love, that success made you cold, but you took what we threw away and turned it into something good." A long breath escaped her. She didn't cry. That would have been too simple. But her voice trembled. "I don't expect forgiveness." I finally turned to her, met her gaze, not to offer absolution, but to offer truth. "I didn't do this for forgiveness," I said. "I did it because someone had to stop the cycle. And if not me, then who?" She nodded. Not in agreement, but in understanding. It was enough. We parted there, by the pool, in the quiet drizzle. I watched her walk away, smaller than I remembered, bent not by age but by the weight of too many choices made in pride and fear. She never looked back. I stayed a while longer, listening to the soft chatter of the garden, the gentle rhythm of rain against the leaves. And then, finally, I left. Not the way I had years ago. Cut out, cast aside, quietly burning inside. This time, I walked away whole. I left behind no monument, no plaque, no shrine to my name. Just a place filled with second chances, louder than any legacy ever written in gold. And for the first time in my life, the silence that followed was not empty. It was peace, complete, unshakable, perfectly earned, and utterly mine.